Officer James walked down Madison Street, his feet heavy after a 12-hour shift. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk, and the cool evening air did little to lift his fatigue. All he could think about was getting home, to his warm bed. A soft padding sound caught his attention. He turned to see a small, scruffy dog following him, its brown fur matted and dirty. James waved his hand dismissively. "Go on, get home." The puppy tilted its head but kept following. Every few steps, James would look back, and there it was, maintaining a careful distance. Its ribs showed through its thin coat, and one ear flopped over while the other stood straight up. "I said go home!" James called out again, this time more firmly. The puppy stopped for a moment, then continued its determined pursuit. After half a block, James stopped walking and turned around completely. The puppy froze mid-step, watching him with wide eyes. There was something in those eyes, not just hunger or fear, but what seemed like desperation. "Listen, buddy, I can't help you. I'm not even supposed to have pets in my building," he muttered, his voice softening despite himself. The puppy sat down right there on the sidewalk, its tail making tiny sweeps across the concrete. James ran a hand over his face and sighed. Something about the way the dog looked at him tugged at his heart. He knelt down slowly, extending his hand. The puppy flinched but held its ground, trembling slightly. "It's okay," James said softly. "I won't hurt you." As he moved closer, he noticed something around the puppy's neck, a worn leather collar barely hanging on. Tucked inside was what looked like a piece of paper, folded and crumpled. James carefully reached for it, speaking in soothing tones as the puppy watched him with those intent eyes. His fingers fumbled with the paper in the dim light. When he finally unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. Written in shaky, childish handwriting were the words, "Help. My brother is sick. No food, no water. Apartment 3B. James's exhaustion vanished instantly. His heart began to pound as the urgency of the situation hit him. He looked at the puppy, who was now standing, tail wagging hopefully. Without another moment's hesitation, James broke into a run. The puppy bounded alongside him, leading the way with newfound energy. The apartment complex loomed before them like a shadow from another era. Paint peeled from its walls in long, jagged strips, and several windows were patched with cardboard instead of glass. The puppy led him through the entrance, where a broken security door hung limply on its hinges. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow on the grimy hallway. James climbed to the 3rd floor, each step making his stomach tighten further, his police instincts on high alert. The puppy's nails clicked against the floor as it trotted ahead, stopping at a door marked 3B in tarnished brass numbers. James knocked firmly. The sound seemed to disappear into the heavy silence of the building. "Police!" he called out, pounding harder this time. No response came from within. Beside him, the puppy began to whine, pawing anxiously at the threshold. James tried the handle, finding it locked. The silence from within the apartment felt wrong, too complete, too heavy. Every instinct from his years on the force screamed that something was terribly wrong. Taking a deep breath, he positioned himself and kicked hard next to the lock. The door burst inward with a sharp crack. The smell hit him first, a thick, oppressive mixture of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and neglect that made him gag. In the corner of the living room, he saw them. A small boy, no more than 8, sat pressed against the wall. His thin arms were wrapped protectively around a bundle. A baby, James realized with a jolt. The older boy's eyes were huge in his gaunt face, reflecting the light like a frightened animal's. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. The baby in his arms was unnaturally still, save for the rapid rise and fall of its chest. James approached the children slowly, his movements deliberate and gentle. He knelt down a few feet away, not wanting to frighten them further. "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm Officer James. I'm here to help." The older boy's grip on his brother tightened. The puppy darted past James and went straight to the boy, its tail wagging as it began licking his face. The unexpected show of affection seemed to break through the boy's fear. Tears welled up in his eyes, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. James pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice calm and steady as he requested paramedics. As he waited, he conducted a quick survey of the apartment, his heart growing heavier with each discovery. The kitchen cabinets stood empty, their doors hanging open like hungry mouths. In the refrigerator, a single carton of expired milk lay on its side, long since curdled. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, the reality of the situation hit James like a physical blow. These boys had no one, no family, no support, no one to care for them or keep them safe. The paramedics burst through the apartment door, their equipment rattling as they rushed to assess the situation. The younger brother lay motionless in his sibling's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. One of the medics gently took the baby, laying him on a portable stretcher. "Severe dehydration," the paramedic muttered to his colleague. "Possible organ failure. We need to move fast." The older boy's eyes widened with fear as they took his brother. He scrambled to his feet, his small hand shooting out to grab James's sleeve. "It's okay," James assured him, placing his hand over the boy's. "They're here to help your brother." The boy wouldn't let go of James's sleeve even as they made their way down to the ambulance. His legs trembled with each step, and James could feel him struggling to stay upright. Without hesitation, James scooped him up, carrying him down the stairs while the puppy trotted faithfully beside them. In the ambulance, the paramedics worked quickly on the baby, attaching IV lines and monitoring equipment. James sat on the bench with the older boy pressed against his side, their hands clasped together. The puppy settled in James's lap, its brown eyes fixed on the boy with unwavering attention. The boy's grip on James's hand tightened with each passing minute until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Is my brother going to die?" James squeezed his hand firmly. "Not on my watch, kid," he replied, his voice steady and determined. "These people are really good at their jobs. They're going to take good care of your brother." The boy nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the small form of his brother on the stretcher. The puppy whined softly, stretching its neck to lick the boy's free hand, drawing a ghost of a smile from him. James looked down at the boy's pleading eyes, then at Sarah, who waited expectantly with her clipboard. He saw the fear in the boy's face, the same fear he'd seen in that dark apartment, the fear of being alone and abandoned again. The puppy whined softly, pressing against the boy's legs as if trying to hold him up. James felt the weight of the moment, the choice before him as clear as day. In his heart, he knew he'd already made it. Pulling Sarah aside in the hallway, his heart raced, but his voice remained steady. "I want to foster them," he said, watching her eyes widen in surprise. "Both of them." Sarah adjusted her glasses, studying him carefully. "Officer James, I understand you feel connected to these boys, but fostering isn't something to take lightly. There's extensive paperwork, home studies, background checks." "I know," James interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "I know it's not simple, but these kids need stability, not another temporary solution. They've been failed by enough adults already." Sarah tapped her pen against her clipboard, her professional demeanor wavering slightly. "Do you truly understand what you're taking on? 2 traumatized children, one of them an infant. It's a huge responsibility." "I've never been more certain of anything," James replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "I can't explain it, but there's something about these boys. I can't walk away." In the hospital room, the boy sat cross-legged on the bed, the puppy curled in his lap. His small fingers stroked the dog's fur methodically, his eyes fixed on his baby brother in the nearby crib. The steady beep of monitors filled the quiet room. James returned with a paper bag full of food from the cafeteria. The smell of warm, Soup and fresh bread filled the air. He noticed how the boy's eyes followed his movements as he set out the food, watching him like a hawk. "Here you go, buddy," James said, handing him a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. The boy accepted them carefully, as if they might disappear. James pretended not to notice as the boy quickly tucked half the sandwich under his pillow, a gesture that spoke volumes, the instinct of someone who'd gone hungry too many times. James's throat tightened, but he kept his voice casual. "There's plenty more where that came from. You can eat as much as you want." The boy glanced at him uncertainly, then at the hidden sandwich, before slowly pulling it back out. The puppy wagged its tail encouragingly. As night fell, the hospital grew quieter. The baby slept peacefully in his crib, his color already better after hours of treatment. James settled into the chair beside the boy's bed, watching as the child fought to keep his eyes open. The puppy had made itself comfortable on the bed, pressed against the boy's side like a furry guardian. James leaned forward, his voice soft, but firm. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," he promised. "Both of you." The boy studied James's face in the dim light, searching for something. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he gave a small, solemn nod. It wasn't much, but in that simple gesture, James saw the first glimpse of trust. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across James's driveway as he pulled in. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the boy, who hadn't spoken a word during the entire ride home. His small hands gripped Lucas's car seat tightly, knuckles white with tension. The puppy sat beside him, pressed close against his leg. "Here we are," James said softly, trying to keep his voice light. He opened the back door, helping first with Lucas's car seat. The boy's grip loosened only slightly, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with practiced wariness. James led them up the short path to his front door. The house wasn't anything special, just a modest single-story home with faded blue paint and white trim. But he'd spent the last few days preparing it, making sure everything was ready for their arrival. "Let me show you around," James offered, unlocking the door. The boy followed silently, still carrying Lucas's car seat despite James's gentle offers to help. The puppy trotted alongside, its nails clicking against the hardwood floors. James started with the kitchen, where he'd stocked the fridge with fresh groceries. "You can eat whenever you're hungry," he explained, opening cabinets to show their contents. No need to ask permission. The boy's eyes widened slightly at the sight of all the food, but his expression remained guarded. Next came the living room with its worn but comfortable couch, and finally, the spare bedroom. James had worked hard to make it welcoming. Fresh. Sheets on the bunk bed, a small nightlight plugged into the wall, even a few stuffed animals arranged on the top bunk. "You can choose whichever bed you want," James said, gesturing to the bunks. "Top or bottom, it's up to you." The boy stood in the doorway, Lucas's car seat still in his arms, his eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail, every possible exit. But he made no move toward either bed. The puppy sat at his feet, looking up at him with concerned eyes. Later that night, after helping the boys settle Lucas into the crib, James went to check on them one last time before bed. The sight that greeted him made his heart clench. The boy hadn't chosen either bunk. Instead, he lay curled up on the floor beside Lucas's crib, the puppy snuggled against his chest. His body was tense, even in sleep, as if ready to spring up at any moment. Moving quietly, James took an extra blanket from the bottom bunk. With gentle movements, careful not to wake him, he draped it over the boy and the puppy. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake, his fingers unconsciously curling into the puppy's fur. James stood there for a moment, watching them sleep. Moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating the boy's face, making him look even younger and more vulnerable. His heart ached at the thought of everything these children must have been through to make a bed feel unsafe. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as James moved around the stove, flipping golden brown pancakes onto a plate. The sizzle of butter and the sweet aroma of maple syrup filled the air. He'd woken up early, wanting to make sure the boys had a proper breakfast. When he turned around, he found the older boy sitting straight at the kitchen table, his hands folded in his lap. The puppy sat faithfully beside his chair, its tail sweeping the floor in gentle swooshes. Dark circles lingered under the boy's eyes, evidence of a restless night on the hard floor. James placed a stack of warm pancakes in front of him, along with butter, syrup, and a glass of milk. The boy's eyes followed every movement, but he didn't reach for anything, his shoulders remaining tense. "Go ahead," James encouraged softly. "They're better while they're warm." The boy glanced at the food, then at James, then back at the food. Slowly, he picked up his fork, his movements careful and deliberate. James busied himself with making more pancakes, trying to ease the tension by not watching too closely. As they ate in a companionable silence, James decided it was time. He couldn't keep calling him the boy in his head. Setting his own fork down, he kept his voice gentle. "What's your name, kid?" The question hung in the air. The boy's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and his eyes dropped to his plate. The puppy nudged his leg with its nose as if offering support. After several long moments, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Noah." James nodded, letting the name settle in his mind. "Nice to meet you, Noah," he replied, keeping his tone casual, as if they were having an ordinary conversation on an ordinary morning. Noah played quietly, with his new toys on a blanket, while James noticed the blue toothbrush set beside his own. It was a small gesture but felt like progress. Maybe Noah could start seeing this place as home. The next day, James parked outside the therapist's office. Noah sat stiffly, fingers clenched around the seatbelt, looking pale without Hero by his side. "Come on, buddy," James said softly, opening the door. But Noah didn't move, eyes fixed on his worn sneakers. "I don't need to talk," he mumbled. James knelt to his level, voice steady. "You don't have to. I'll be right here when you're done." Noah hesitated, searching James's face for any hint of a lie. Finding none, he gave a slight nod. Inside, while Noah met with the therapist, James flipped through his case file, the one he'd been avoiding. Page after page revealed a heartbreaking story of neglect and absence. James's chest tightened at every detail. When the session ended, Noah's eyes were rimmed red. Without a word, he walked close to James, shoulders barely brushing. The drive home was quiet until Noah's small voice broke the silence. "You're not going to leave, right?" he whispered. The question hung in the air, raw and uncertain. "Never, kid," James replied firmly. That night, when James returned home, he found Noah outside on the back steps with Hero. The boy's face was turned to the stars, eyes distant. "Thought maybe they'd come back," Noah said, voice cracking. James sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his thin shoulders. "You don't have to figure it out alone," he assured. "You've got me." Noah tensed at first, then slowly leaned into the embrace, letting his guard slip just a bit. The next day at school, a group of older boys blocked Noah's path. When one of them kicked Hero, something in Noah snapped. He shoved the boy hard, fury surging. A teacher pulled them apart, voice sharp with disapproval. James arrived to find Noah's fists clenched, eyes dark with anger and fear. Back home, James spoke gently. "I'm not mad," he said, "but fighting isn't the way." "He hurt Hero," Noah choked out. "I know," James sighed. "But protecting someone doesn't always mean fighting." That evening, James brought out a soccer ball to break the tension. After a few hesitant moments, Noah joined in. Hero barked excitedly, tail wagging. When James dramatically missed a shot, Noah's guarded expression cracked with a small laugh. They played until the sun dipped low, Noah's laughter a fragile but hopeful sound. That night, for the first time, Noah slept in his bed instead of the floor. Hero curled beside him. Watching them, James felt a spark of hope. But that hope faltered when his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar voice hesitated on the other end. Is Noah okay?" It was his mother. Her words came fast and desperate, full of excuses. But all James could think of was Noah's haunted eyes and the silence between his words. "You abandoned them," James cut in coldly. "Noah doesn't need false hope." He ended the call, hands shaking. At dinner, Noah barely spoke, pushing food around his plate. His small voice finally broke the silence. "Do you think they're ever coming back?" he asked, eyes downcast. James's chest tightened. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But no matter what, I'm here. You're not alone." Noah's eyes shimmered before he gave a slight nod. Hero pressed close, a steadying presence in the uncertainty. Look even younger than his 8 years, taking a deep breath. James turned to face him fully. He thought about sugarcoating it about, offering some comforting lie. But Noah had faced too many harsh truths in his young life to deserve anything less than honesty. "I don't know," James said gently. "But I do know this family isn't about who leaves. It's about who stays." No fingers found. Their way into Hero's fur gripping tightly. The dog stayed perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of this moment. The clock ticked softly in the background as Noah processed James's words finally in a whisper, so quiet James almost missed. Noah said you stayed." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. James felt his throat tighten with emotion always. He replied firmly. Noah swallowed hard and nodded back. James watched as something shifted in the boy's expression. For the first time since he'd known him, Noah didn't look like he was waiting for someone else to return. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees, scattering golden leaves across the weathered path. Noah walked beside James, one hand holding Hero's leash, while the other swung freely at his side. The boy seemed lighter these days, more present in the moment, rather than lost in worried thoughts. His shoulders weren't as tense as they used to be, and sometimes he even hummed quietly to himself as they walked. Then, without warning, Noah stopped dead in his tracks. His whole body went rigid, and Hero's leash slipped from his suddenly slack fingers. The color drained from his face as James followed Noah's frozen gaze across the path and felt his own heart skip a beat. The peaceful afternoon shattered like glass. There she stood, Noah's mother. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair unkempt, and her eyes were fixed on Noah with an intensity that made James's protective instincts flare. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands fidgeted restlessly at her sides. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of Noah, feeling the boy's small hand grab the back of his jacket, fingers twisting into the fabric. She approached them with unsteady steps. Her eyes glassy and unfocused, words tumbled from her mouth in a rush stream. "Noah, I'm so sorry. I was going to come back." Her voice cracked with desperation as she took another step forward, leaves crunching beneath her worn sneakers. Noah's grip on James's jacket tightened until his knuckles turned white, but he remained silent. Hero, sensing the tension, moved closer to Noah's side and let out a low, warning growl. When Noah's mother reached toward him, the dog's protective stance made it clear he wouldn't let anyone hurt his boy. James stood his ground, his voice firm and controlled, despite the anger burning in his chest. "You don't get to just show up." He could feel Noah trembling slightly behind him, could sense the storm of emotions, radiating from the child he'd grown to love as his own. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and broken promises. Then Noah stepped out from behind James, though he kept hold of his hand. His voice was quiet, but remarkably steady as he looked at his mother. His chin lifted slightly in a show of courage that made James's heart ache with pride. "You left us," those 3 words carried the weight of countless hungry nights of changing Lucas's diapers with no help of wondering if they would survive another day. The memories of empty cupboards and cold rooms hung in the air between them. His mother opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She closed it again, her shoulders sagging, the fight seeming to drain out of her entirely. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Noah simply turned away. James placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder as they walked away. Hero padding faithfully beside them, the autumn breeze picked up again, sending more leaves. Dancing around their feet, Noah didn't look back, his steps growing stronger with each foot of distance between him and his past. If you enjoyed the story of Officer James, I've handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.